Welcome, brave souls, to another journey into darkness. If you value your sanity, or what's left of it, subscribe now and prepare yourself for more bone-chilling stories that haunt the night. Go ahead, hit that like button if you dare, and share this video with others who crave the unsettling touch of fear. Every like, every share, draws us deeper into the unknown. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and let the terror begin.
Sarah shivered on the side of the desolate highway, her motorcycle a dark, silent shape behind her. The engine had sputtered to a stop more than an hour ago, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal. She hadn't seen another vehicle in what felt like forever, and the shadows were lengthening as the night grew colder. Desperation was beginning to creep in. Headlights appeared in the distance, a pair of glowing eyes piercing the darkness. She raised her thumb, praying for the driver to stop. The old pickup truck slowed as it approached, pulling to a stop beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man in his mid-40s, his face rugged and his eyes shadowed beneath a worn baseball cap. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Sarah hesitated. There was something about his voice that set her on edge, but what choice did she have? She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm heading toward Whitestone. Is that on your way?" "Sure is," he said, gesturing for her to climb in. "Hop in. You don't want to be out here when it gets dark." The passenger door creaked as she opened it, and the stale smell of tobacco greeted her. She climbed in, shutting the door behind her. The man turned his gaze back to the road and pulled away, the truck's engine grumbling as it picked up speed. "Thanks for stopping," Sarah said, trying to break the silence. "I didn't think anyone would come by this late." "Not many do," he replied without looking at her. "You got lucky." Sarah couldn't shake a feeling of unease. As they drove, the woods on either side of the road seemed to press closer, the trees growing thicker and darker. The truck's headlights pierced the darkness, but they seemed unable to fully cut through it. A chill crept down her spine when she noticed that they had turned onto a narrow dirt road. "Is this a shortcut?" she asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Yeah," he said, his tone flat. "It's faster this way." The truck bumped along the dirt path, the forest crowding in from all sides. They came to a small clearing where an old cabin stood, half buried in the overgrowth. It looked abandoned, with rotting wood and dark, cracked windows that reflected nothing. The sight of it made Sarah's skin crawl. The truck stopped, and the man turned off the engine. The sudden silence was unnerving. "This doesn't look like Whitestone," Sarah said, her hand inching toward the door handle. "No," he replied, turning to face her at last. There was something in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. "But it's where we're supposed to be." Before Sarah could react, the door locks clicked shut on their own. Her heart pounded as she yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The man's gaze was fixed on her, his expression calm and devoid of any emotion. Without a word, he climbed out of the truck and walked around to her side, wrenching open the door and grabbing her arm. "Let go of me," she screamed, thrashing against his grip. He pulled her out of the truck effortlessly, dragging her toward the cabin. She struggled, kicking at his legs and clawing at his hands, but it was as if he had an unnatural strength. As they neared the cabin, a strange feeling came over her, an oppressive heaviness in the air, like the world was pressing down on her. He shoved her through the open doorway and into the darkness of the cabin. She hit the wooden floor hard, gasping as the stale air filled her lungs. The man followed, closing the door behind him, and then lit a small kerosene lantern, casting a sickly yellow glow around the room. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something far more sinister. In the center of the room was an altar, a crude stone slab covered in dark stains that Sarah didn't need to guess were blood. Strange symbols were carved into the surface, their twisted lines seeming to writhe and pulse in the lantern light. What is this?" she whispered, backing away from the altar, her eyes darting around for any possible escape. The man didn't answer. He moved with a deliberate calm, reaching into a wooden chest beside the altar and pulling out a length of rope. His voice was low and devoid of any emotion as he spoke. "You should never have accepted a ride from a stranger." Before she could react, he lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. Sarah fought with every ounce of strength she had, but he was relentless. He pinned her arms behind her back and began tying her wrists together with the rough rope. She kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against a steel vise. He dragged her to the altar and shoved her against the stone. The cold surface sent a shiver through her body. As he worked to secure her arms and legs to the corners of the slab, she noticed something. Carved directly above her head was a symbol unlike the others. It was a pentagram surrounded by intricate markings, and as she stared at it, she felt a deep, almost primal dread settle in her gut. "What are you going to do?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes met hers, and for a moment they seemed to gleam with a strange, unholy light. "You're the offering," he said simply, as though that explained everything. The final piece. He walked over to a small table near the wall, where an assortment of objects lay, a curved dagger, black candles, and a bowl filled with a dark, viscous substance. As he reached for the dagger, Sarah realized with mounting horror that this wasn't just some deranged act of violence. It was a ritual. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking, "you don't have to do this." The man ignored her, lighting the candles with the lantern's flame and arranging them around the altar. As he did, he began to chant in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, resonating in her bones. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow faintly, as if responding to the incantation. The oppressive heaviness in the room deepened, and Sarah felt as though the very air were suffocating her. The symbols on the altar flared brighter, and a foul stench filled the air, like sulfur and decay. The walls of the cabin seemed to bend inward, and the shadows danced wildly around the flickering candlelight. As the man raised the dagger above her, his chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The pentagram above her head now glowed with a malevolent red light. Sarah thrashed against her bindings, desperately trying to break free, but the ropes only tightened, digging into her skin. Suddenly, the air grew impossibly cold, and a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It wasn't the man making the sound. Something else was here, something ancient and terrible, awakened by the ritual. The air seemed to ripple, and the very darkness in the corners of the cabin took on a life of its own, coalescing into a vague, monstrous shape. The man's chanting stopped abruptly, and he staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. "No, this isn't right," he muttered, clutching the dagger as if it could protect him. The shadowy form loomed over the altar, a formless darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Its shape twisted and shifted, occasionally revealing glimpses of something unnatural, glowing eyes, twisted limbs, gaping maws that seemed to open and close within the darkness. It was a being that defied understanding, a thing summoned from beyond the veil. Sarah felt its gaze upon her, a cold, consuming force that seemed to pierce her very soul. The ropes binding her limbs began to fray and fall away, as if the creature was unraveling them with its will alone. She struggled to sit up, her eyes locked on the man, who was now backing away from the altar, his face pale with terror. You can't," he stammered, raising the dagger. "You were supposed to." Before he could finish, the shadow surged forward, enveloping him. His scream was swallowed up in an instant, and his body seemed to crumple and dissolve into the darkness, leaving nothing behind. The shadow reared back, its attention turning once more to Sarah. For a moment, there was silence, and then a voice echoed in her mind, not spoken aloud but felt, like a deep tremor within her chest. "You were meant to be a sacrifice, but now you are something else." The darkness seemed to retract slightly, and Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to flee. She scrambled off the altar and bolted for the door, her body shaking with adrenaline and terror. She didn't look back as she burst into the cold night, sprinting down the dirt path as fast as her legs would carry her. As she reached the main road, she stopped to catch her breath and dared to glance back. The cabin stood silently in the clearing, the glow from within extinguished. But she could still feel it, the oppressive presence, the lingering sense that something had been awakened and was watching her, even now. She didn't know how long she ran or how far she went, but she didn't stop until she saw the lights of Whitestone in the distance. Only then did she slow down. Sarah didn't stop until she stumbled into the outskirts of Whitestone, her body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The dim streetlights cast long shadows over the quiet town, and the stillness felt eerie, as if the world was holding its breath. She was gasping for air, her clothes torn and skin scraped from the escape through the forest. Her mind raced with the memory of the cabin and the shadow that had swallowed the man whole. She stumbled into a small diner on the edge of town, the bell above the door jangling as she entered. The warmth inside wrapped around her, and she slumped into the first booth she saw, struggling to catch her breath. The few patrons inside turned to look at her, their conversations trailing off at the sight of the disheveled girl. A waitress hurried over, concern etched on her face. "Honey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah's throat was dry, and when she tried to speak, the words wouldn't come. She swallowed hard and nodded shakily. I need help," she finally managed to whisper. "There was a man, he tried to." Her voice faltered, and she wasn't sure how to explain what she had seen. The waitress's frown deepened, and she looked toward the cook behind the counter. "Call the sheriff, Pete. Tell him there's a girl here who needs help." Within minutes, the sheriff arrived, a gruff-looking man in his 50s, with a weathered face and a stern expression. He took a seat across from Sarah, his eyes scanning her for signs of injury. "Miss, I'm Sheriff Logan. Can you tell me what happened?" She took a shaky breath and recounted everything. The motorcycle breaking down, the ride with the man, the cabin, and the ritual. When she described the altar and the shadowy figure, Sheriff Logan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing until she had finished. "I know it sounds crazy," Sarah said, her voice breaking, "but it happened. There was something in that cabin, something that wasn't human." Logan remained silent for a moment, then glanced at the waitress and the other onlookers. "All right, folks, show's over. Let's give the young lady some space." When the diner quieted down, he leaned in closer, his voice low. "You said this was out near the old service road, right? Did the man give you a name?" "No," Sarah replied, her hands trembling in her lap. "But he seemed like he knew what he was doing, like he'd done it before." The sheriff's eyes darkened. "There's been talk over the years about that cabin. Stories of strange happenings, people disappearing. I've even heard about rituals, though nothing's ever been confirmed." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "But you're saying something supernatural was involved? Something alive?" Sarah nodded. "I know how it sounds, but I swear I'm telling the truth. That thing, it killed him." Logan exhaled deeply. "We'll look into it, but Whitestone isn't exactly known for this sort of thing." He stood up and nodded to the waitress. "Get her something to eat. She's been through hell." As the sheriff turned to leave, Sarah reached out, grabbing his arm. "Please, don't go there alone," she pleaded. "That place, it's dangerous." He gave her a reassuring nod. "Don't worry, miss. I'll take backup." The hours crawled by and the diner grew quiet again. Sarah sat at the booth, sipping hot coffee to calm her nerves. She had tried calling someone for help, but her phone was dead, and there was no one she trusted enough in town. She was too exhausted to sleep, too scared to stay awake. Her eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see the darkness outside shifting. Watching. She was about to ask the waitress if there was somewhere she could lie down when the bell above the door jingled. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as two deputies walked in, grim expressions on their faces. She recognized Sheriff Logan's voice behind them, but something was different. There was an edge in his tone, a coldness that hadn't been there before. "Miss, I need you to come with us," he said, striding up to her booth. "We need you to show us exactly where this cabin is." Sarah recoiled, her fear rekindled by the way the sheriff's eyes seemed off. There was a flatness to them, a glint that made her skin crawl. "I told you where it was," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to go back there." Logan's expression hardened. "We need you to come with us, Sarah. There's been another development." As she hesitated, she noticed a peculiar scent. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the same sulfuric odor she had smelled at the cabin, the same underlying stench of decay. Her gaze flicked to the deputies, and she realized with a jolt of terror that their faces were pale, their eyes distant and glazed. They were standing unnaturally still, like puppets awaiting their master's command. The sheriff leaned closer, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "You're coming with us. Now." Sarah bolted from the booth, knocking over her coffee cup in the process. The liquid spilled across the table as she ran for the back exit. The deputies reacted sluggishly, as if they were moving through water. But Sheriff Logan was faster, lunging after her with a growl that didn't sound entirely human. She crashed through the back door and into the night, her feet pounding against the pavement as she sprinted down the alley. The cold air burned her lungs, and her pulse throbbed in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get as far away from that diner as possible. As she rounded a corner, she skidded to a stop, her breath catching in her throat. The pickup truck was there, parked at the edge of the lot. Its headlights were off, but she could feel a dark presence emanating from it, a silent invitation to return to where it had all begun. The truck door creaked open on its own, as if beckoning her inside. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man who had abducted her, the one who had tied her to the altar, was sitting in the driver's seat. His form was twisted and distorted, his skin pulled taut over his bones. His eyes, black as pitch, stared directly at her. Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her. The thing in the driver's seat was a grotesque parody of what she had seen before. His skin was pale and stretched, his features flickering and distorting like a shadow cast by an unsteady flame. His voice, when it came, was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to resonate with an unnatural depth. "Get in," he repeated, his mouth curling into a twisted semblance of a smile. "It's time to finish what we started." Panic surged through her, and she took a step back, ready to bolt in the opposite direction. But before she could move, the truck's engine rumbled to life. The sound was wrong, too deep, almost like a growl emanating from the darkness itself. The dim light from the street lamps barely cut through the gloom around the truck, casting long shadows that seemed to creep and shift. Sarah tore her eyes away with great effort, shaking off the disorienting pull. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the pavement as she headed toward the main road, desperate for some sign of life, anywhere but near that truck. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted, her muscles burning from exhaustion and fear. Behind her, she heard the creak of the truck door slamming shut, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. The thing that had once been the man from the cabin was following her. Its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if it was in no rush to catch its prey. Sarah didn't dare look back. She knew if she did, she might lose whatever fleeting resolve she had left. The town was eerily silent as she ran down the darkened streets, the streetlights casting pale cones of light on the cracked asphalt. She spotted a narrow alleyway ahead and ducked into it, hoping to lose her pursuer in the maze of backstreets. She pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she struggled to stay silent. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet and her own frantic heartbeat. Then, from the darkness at the mouth of the alley, came a low, guttural chuckle, the kind that made her skin crawl. "You can't hide from this, Sarah," the voice echoed, deeper now, almost as if it were coming from the shadows themselves. "You were chosen." The air seemed to grow thicker, colder. It felt as though the darkness itself was closing in around her, suffocating her. Then she noticed something strange. The shadows along the alley walls were shifting, crawling up from the ground and merging together, as if forming a solid shape. She blinked in disbelief as a figure began to materialize from the darkness, a monstrous silhouette that vaguely resembled the man, but was something far more malevolent. Its eyes gleamed faintly, reflecting the pale light of the street lamps like an animal's in the dark. Its form was hazy, like smoke or mist, coiling and writhing as it took a step toward her. The temperature plummeted further, and her breath misted in the frigid air. Without thinking, she darted out of the alley and back onto the street, her mind racing for a plan. She needed to get somewhere safe, anywhere away from this thing. But Whitestone seemed deserted, as if the entire town had been swallowed up by the same malevolent force chasing her. Even the houses she passed seemed dark and lifeless, the windows like hollow eyes watching her plight with indifference. Sarah's foot caught on something, and she stumbled to the ground, her palms scraping against the rough pavement. She quickly scrambled to her feet, ignoring the stinging pain in her hands. As she regained her footing, her gaze landed on a small church at the end of the block. The stained glass windows glowed faintly in the moonlight, and the front doors were slightly ajar. With a surge of desperate hope, she sprinted toward the church. The heavy wooden doors groaned as she pushed them open, and she rushed inside, slamming them shut behind her. She collapsed against the door, her chest heaving as she listened for any sign that the thing had followed her. The church was dimly lit, candles flickering at the altar. The air was musty, but the faint scent of incense lingered, a sharp contrast to the sulfuric stench that seemed to follow her since the cabin. She took a few hesitant steps forward, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed back to her, unanswered. The church seemed empty, but it felt safe, at least safer than the streets outside. As she made her way down the aisle, her gaze fell upon a large, ancient-looking crucifix hanging above the altar. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her pause. The figure of Christ seemed oddly twisted, as though the wood itself had warped over time, and the eyes seemed to follow her movements. A sudden thud echoed from the back of the church, and Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. There, just inside the door, stood the shadowy figure. It had taken on a more solid form now, its features becoming clearer, a grotesque fusion of the man's twisted visage and something far more sinister. Its eyes were empty voids, absorbing the dim light as it grinned with an impossible width. "You can't escape, Sarah," it hissed, taking a step forward. "The ritual was never about me. It was always about you. You were marked the moment you set foot in that cabin." Sarah backed away, her hands instinctively reaching for the altar behind her. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She grabbed it without hesitation, a silver chalice, and hurled it at the creature. The chalice passed through the thing's form as though it were made of smoke, clattering uselessly to the floor. The figure laughed, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to fill the entire church. "Objects of faith won't help you," it taunted. "Not when you've already been claimed." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could help. Her gaze fell on the candles lining the altar, and she remembered something she had read once about rituals, about the power of fire to cleanse and banish evil. She grabbed one of the tall, burning candles and turned to face the entity. "Stay back!" she shouted, thrusting the flame toward it. The shadow recoiled slightly as if repelled by the light, and for a brief moment its form wavered. Encouraged, Sarah advanced, holding candle out in front of her like a weapon. "Leave me alone!" The creature snarled, its voice twisting into a harsh growl. "You cannot destroy what is already bound to you," it hissed. "You were chosen to complete the summoning, to bring it into this world." The air around Sarah seemed to ripple with a sudden, oppressive weight, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. She felt a surge of dark energy coursing through the church, as if something ancient and malevolent was stirring, awakened by the ritual that had started at the cabin. The shadows along the walls began to stretch and grow, merging together to form a swirling vortex of darkness above the altar. The thing's voice grew louder, a chaotic chorus of many voices, all chanting in that same infernal language she had heard before. The pentagram carved into the stone beneath the altar glowed a sickly green, and Sarah could feel a force tugging at her, pulling her toward it. The darkness began to wrap around her, tightening like a noose. She struggled against the invisible pull, her vision blurring as the room seemed to spin around her. With a final desperate scream, she thrust the candle into the center of the pentagram. The flame flared brighter, and the symbols seemed to explode with light. There was a deafening roar as the darkness recoiled violently, shattering like glass. The entity let out a horrible, echoing scream, its form unraveling into wisps of black smoke that dissipated into the air. The oppressive force lifted, and the room fell silent once more. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The candles around the altar had burned out, and the faint light of dawn was beginning to creep through the stained glass windows, painting the church in soft hues of red and gold. She lay there, exhausted and trembling, as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the floor. Whatever had been awakened was gone, at least for now. But as she closed her eyes, she could still hear the faintest whisper echoing in her mind. "It's not over, Sarah. It will never be over." and somewhere in the distance a low, guttural chuckle seemed to resonate, as if the darkness was simply biding its time, waiting for its next chance to claim what it had started. The first rays of dawn bathed the church in a gentle light, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion and relief, but she knew she wasn't truly safe until she left Whitestone behind for good. She struggled to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady, and made her way toward the church doors. Pushing them open, she stumbled out into the early morning chill. The town seemed unnaturally still, as if it had been frozen in time while she fought for her life inside the church. The streets were empty, and even the wind felt muted, barely stirring the leaves on the trees. Sarah knew she couldn't stay here. Whatever had been summoned in that cabin was gone for now. But its lingering presence seemed to cling to the town itself, a darkness that wouldn't easily let go. She had to get back to her motorcycle or find some other way out. She started walking down the street, her muscles aching with each step. The events of the night felt like a fever dream, but the raw scrapes on her hands and the bruises on her body were proof that it had all been real. She kept glancing back over her shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure following her again, but there was nothing, only the quiet, empty town. As she reached the edge of Whitestone, she saw a familiar shape. Her motorcycle, still leaning against the side of the road where it had broken down hours ago. It was a sight that almost brought tears to her eyes. She quickened her pace, stumbling toward it as though it were a lifeline. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the bike and reached for the ignition, her hands trembling as she tried to calm her racing heart. She didn't know if the engine would start, or if she'd even have enough strength left to ride it, but she had to try. Anything was better than staying in this cursed place a moment longer. She turned the key, and the motorcycle sputtered to life with a reluctant growl. Relief flooded her as she felt the familiar rumble beneath her. She kicked it into gear, her muscles straining as she urged the bike forward and tore down the road as fast as she could manage. The town of Whitestone disappeared behind her, fading into the distance like a bad memory. The morning air whipped against her face, stinging her cheeks, but it felt good, real. She rode for what seemed like hours, pushing herself and the motorcycle far beyond the boundaries of exhaustion. The winding roads stretched on, leading her farther from that dark place, and with each mile, she felt a small weight lift from her chest. When she finally pulled over at a gas station several towns away, Sarah's entire body ached. She parked the bike and slid off the seat, her legs almost giving out beneath her. She stumbled into the small convenience store, where a clerk gave her a startled look. "You okay, miss?" he asked, eyeing her disheveled appearance with concern. Sarah nodded weakly. "Just need some water and a phone." Her voice came out hoarse and dry, barely above a whisper. The clerk handed her a bottle of water, and she gulped it down, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. As she reached for the phone, she hesitated, unsure of who to call. The police? She doubted they'd believe her story. There was no evidence, no witnesses. And even if they did believe her, there was no way they could stop whatever had been unleashed in Whitestone. Instead, she dialed the only person she could think of, her sister, Julie. The phone rang several times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello?" Julie's voice was thick with sleep, but it quickly sharpened with concern. "Sarah? Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," Sarah croaked, tears welling up in her eyes as the sound of her sister's voice brought a wave of relief. I need your help. I need to get away from here." Julie's voice softened. "Of course, Sarah. Where are you? I'll come get you right now." Sarah gave her the name of the gas station, her voice shaking as she tried to explain that she just needed to be far from where she was. Julie didn't question it, she just promised to come as soon as possible. As she hung up the phone, Sarah felt a deep exhaustion settle over her. She wandered back outside, where the early morning sunlight was steadily growing warmer. She leaned against the side of the gas station, taking deep breaths, trying to steady herself. For the first time in hours, she felt something close to safe. But just as she allowed herself to relax, a faint sound reached her ears, a low, barely audible hum. Her pulse quickened as she turned to scan the road behind her, half expecting to see that truck rumbling toward her. But there was nothing. The road was empty, yet there was an unease that lingered, like a dark cloud just out of view. The faint hum seemed to reverberate in the air, and Sarah's mind raced with the memory of that terrible night. The shadows, the cabin, the unholy ritual. It was over, wasn't it? She forced herself to shake off the feeling. Whatever had been summoned in Whitestone had lost its power when she destroyed the pentagram. The darkness had retreated, and she had escaped. It was over. It had to be. Julie arrived an hour later, pulling up in her car with a worried expression etched across her face. She rushed over to Sarah, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "What happened to you?" she asked, pulling back to look her sister over with concern. "You look like you've been through hell." "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Sarah replied, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. I need to get far away from here." Julie didn't press for details. She helped Sarah into the car and glanced back at the motorcycle. "What about your bike?" Sarah shook her head. "Leave it. I don't want anything that connects me to that place." Julie nodded and climbed back into the driver's seat, starting the engine. As they drove away from the gas station, Sarah looked back one last time, her gaze lingering on the road that led back to Whitestone. The darkness seemed far away now, the memory of it like a bad dream. But as the town disappeared behind them, she couldn't shake the sense that something was still out there, biding its time. She could feel it, a faint tug at the edge of her consciousness, as if some ancient force was still watching, still waiting for its moment to return. Sarah turned away from the window, leaning her head back against the seat. Whatever had begun in that cursed cabin was behind her now, and she was alive. She had survived. But as the miles rolled on, a quiet vow formed in her mind, a promise to herself that she would never speak of what had happened, that she would bury the memory deep and never let the darkness find her again. Yet somewhere, in the shadows of Whitestone and the forests beyond, a quiet chuckle seemed to echo through the night, as though the darkness hadn't truly been banished, only waiting for its next chance to claim what it had started. For now, though, Sarah was free. And that would have to be enough.